Well, around Canada and here in Ottawa on Parliament Hill, post-secondary students are taking part in a National Day of Action. Their activities are aimed at drawing the attention of governments, both provincial and federal, to issues of record high levels of student debt, tuition fees, and the general issue of accessibility of university and college education. Here in Ottawa, student leaders spent the day on Parliament Hill, and they were also meeting with politicians of all stripes. Earlier, I was joined by two student leaders to discuss their day of action. Roxanne Dubois and Sarah Jane King, thank you very much for coming in. I want to ask you first and foremost, this is a day of action, a national day of action. Let's start with you, Roxanne. What are you hoping to get? What are your demands of the federal government? What are you hoping to see happen?
Well, today, students across the country are taking action in their campuses and in their communities. And the main messages that we're sending with the federal government are reduce tuition fees, drop student debt, and increase education funding. So that's really what we're looking at. We're looking at how to make education a right in Canada.
And you're here on Parliament Hill, so you're focusing, the ones who are here in Ottawa, you're focusing on the federal government. A lot of people say student tuition, accessibility, a lot of those bread and butter issues are determined by provincial governments. So how do you get the feds' attention? Because that's often the refrain you hear in this town.
Well, here's an interesting fact, is that tuition fees in Newfoundland and Labrador are just over $2,000 per year for students. In Ontario, there's $6,000, $6,600 a year per student. So there's a huge difference between the provinces in terms of what students are having to pay, which means that there's no strategy across Canada on access to post-secondary education. And it's an issue because it means that as a student, we'll have different access to education depending on where we are.
Okay, Sarah Jane, I was looking through your literature, and one of the things that you're stressing and you're compiling year by year by year is the debt clock, the National Student Debt Clock. What can you tell me about that? What is the level of student debt these days?
Well, we're getting dangerously close to $15 billion at the federal level alone. So that doesn't include provincial loans or private loans that students often have to take out when the loans that they get from the government just aren't enough.
So that's total debt of all of the students who have incurred debts with the federal government?
Right, $15 billion.
Wow. So what's to be done about it?
Well, students need to continue pressuring our government, both at the federal and provincial level, to make sure that we get more access, more funding. And we know that the easiest way to make that happen is actually to decrease tuition fees across the board and to make sure that all students have access. The answer is not to just keep lifting the ceiling to increase the amount of debt that students can take on. That's not sustainable. That's going to keep putting generations and generations into further debt.
My question is, what we hear is, and you'll bear this out, and that there's a huge level of individual student debts. I mean, each of you and everyone we talk to has a very high level of student debts. We're talking sometimes $20,000, $30,000, $40,000. If year to year to year, students survive and continue to deal with that high level of debt, isn't there the risk that it just becomes institutionalized? And the people up there will say, that's the way it is. Canadian students and their families will bear that debt. It's an investment, we hear, and it's an investment you're willing to make, and it's a debt you're willing to take on. How do you respond to that?
It's obviously a huge risk, and in fact, it's part of the message that we're coming here to say is that we need a plan, we need a strategy to address this, because we're putting a huge weight on our youth and on our a generation of people who should be able to pursue their education, to develop their full potential, so that eventually we can contribute to the Canadian economy. I mean, it's not that complicated, and so what we're asking is for a federal vision on post-secondary education. Now, even though it's a provincial responsibility, so is healthcare, and the federal government does have a strategy for healthcare and making sure that every Canadian has a basic level of access to healthcare. And so we see something similar for post-secondary education.
Do you have any indication that this government has any desire to get more involved in something that's largely provincial, to get more involved in post-secondary education?
Well, we know that over 80% of Canadians support a reduction or a freeze in tuition fees in their province, and so there is support. Canadians think that education should be affordable and accessible in Canada, and so we're hoping that the federal will take on this opportunity to show leadership and to have vision for education.
How do you stay optimistic? Sarah Jane, I'll ask you, how do you stay optimistic? Because last year in the federal budget, I think there were some measures to do with part-time student loans, making it a bit easier easier to repay. There's not a lot in a federal budget for student loans and accessibility of post-secondary education. How do you feel optimistic? And this is also now a majority government.
Right.
Last year, for example, if you're lobbying last year, it was a minority government that was arguably more willing to make some concessions. This is a majority government facing a record high deficit. How can you be optimistic?
Well, when students are joining together across the country like we've seen today, it's very encouraging because we know that Canadians are behind us and we know that students are taking action and want to see change. And so continuing to mobilize students and work on those things while at the same time continuing those discussions on the Hill, at Queen's Park, with the people that can make these decisions is going to lead us somewhere. We know that student action in the past has worked. We've won a new grant program about 5 years ago after the last National Day of Action from a Conservative minority government. So we've seen student action work. We need to continue to just hold our politicians' feet to the fire and make sure that they respond to our demands.
Last question on this National Day of Action. I know some of the labor groups were up, so CLC representatives were up there encouraging you, introducing you to people. Are you getting doors opening in terms of your MPs? Are MPs talking to you?
We had a good presence of members of Parliament and politicians in general at our Day of Action in Ottawa and elsewhere. It's part of a long struggle, right? It's part of a long fight to make sure that education is right in Canada. We believe that you shouldn't have to have a lot of money to be able to pursue your education. And if we go along the path that we're in now, that's increasingly where we're going. And so education should be right. It should be adequately funded, and we're looking for leadership on that.
Okay, both of you, thank you very much for coming in, and have a good rest of your National Day of Action.
Thank you so much.